Hello, AIASCS2022. I am here to talk to you about counting animals in the archaeological and textual records of ancient Greece. Now, this is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. I've been working on this project for several years, and thanks to funding from my Marie Curie Fellowship, I'm moving towards publishing it right now. So I really welcome any questions or comments or thoughts. So counting animals, it sounds kind of boring, and it can be quite tedious. And so I hope that I can keep your excitement and energy level up here and keep you from falling asleep as we count some sheep and some animals. For those of you that have tuned into some of my online lectures over the last 2 years of this pandemic, there is a whole lot of new stuff here, especially in the second half of this talk, but I want to get everybody up to speed. Another reason that some of you might be wanting to doze off is there's going to be a lot of graphs. This is going to be a quantitative presentation, but I promise you they will look confusing at first, but they'll make more sense. They're very understandable, or so I hope, and we'll walk through some of the problems with them as well. So animals are quite unique. They exist in large numbers in our different sources of evidence. Which is really important. They tell us a lot about the past. They were very important in ancient Greek culture, for example. People gathered together to feast on animals in large-scale sacrifices. They were an important part of the economy. And at the same time, because they appear in such large numbers throughout our different sources of evidence, we can use them to try to better understand our evidence, which is where I'm headed with this. I think it's really, really fascinating. So zooarchaeology, I'm a zooarchaeologist. I mostly sit around an archaeological lab, counting animals, really just counting their bones and teeth. And so that's kind of what I do. It's counting their trash of sort of foodstuffs most of the time. Now, zooarchaeology is very much a quantitative field of study. It's large scale, it's multivariable. In my short career, have counted nearly 1 million different animal bones from different sites. And so we can say a lot from this because we have such large data sets that talk about different aspects of how animals were raised, butchered, consumed, whether they were burned in a ritual, etc. Now, to be able to compare this kind of evidence to something like literary sources, I think it's important to try to take a quantitative approach to this. And for that, I've used digital humanities resources, specifically the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, to query ancient Greek texts. I'm trained as a classicist. I read ancient Greek. And so fortunately, the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae lets us use a lemma. So I can search for bous and it'll give me all the declensions of it, for example, in Homer's Iliad. And then I can start going through that. Now, to try to create a sort of robust, secure data set, I've limited myself to complete or mostly complete texts from well-known authors through the classical period, through the 4th century BCE. Plus, I've added in Athenaeus because he tells us a lot. He's a Roman author, but he tells us a lot about ancient food and cuisine. And so I think it's really interesting, and we'll see why in a bit. But so it's only complete text that I focused on, not fragments, except for those, of course, found in these complete texts. And when I go through and I search, I have to go carefully read each result, and then I can tally it. And I can get results like this of different cattle terms in different genres and different authors and different texts. Now, there's a lot of problems with this. For example, the sheep, goat, apple problem. In zooarchaeology, looking at animal bones, it's well known that distinguishing sheep from goat bones is quite difficult. They're really, really quite similar. They look almost identical, and it's only really tiny criteria that can tell them apart. On average, I can identify maybe 1/3 of all my sheep or goat bones to either sheep or goat, and the rest are just sheep/goat. With those, I divide them proportionally. But texts are not without their problems as well. For example, Milan in epic poetry means sheep most of the time, or sometimes sheep and goats or goats. But in prose, in non-poetic literature, it means apple or fruit. So it's difficult. I have to go through and carefully look at the context of each of the results when I query the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae. It's not just a matter of plugging into the database and then returning results. Each of these I go to read the context to make sure that each of them is interpreted as the correct animal. So, all right, I'm going to start with zooarchaeology as a zooarchaeologist, and I'm going to build up with some of the results that I've published already. So if we count animals, and I'm going to focus at first on the main animal groups that we get in our bone assemblages, which is sheep, goat, pig, and cow. So you're going to see several of these graphs. They're all going to be the same coloring. At the bottom in yellow is cattle, then pig is in blue, light green is sheep, and dark green is goat. If the analysts that published the results did not distinguish between sheep and goat, then it's kind of this bright green. And this is represented as a percentage of the overall assemblage. So the 100% of the assemblage and the different proportions of sheep, goat, pig, and cow. At the top, I give you the most common of animal at each site. And so this gives us a sense of what's going on in the late Bronze Age in Greece. And it's really interesting because most of the sites, this data set looks pretty homogeneous. Sheep are the most common animal at almost every single site in the late Bronze Age. And this might relate to a palatial interest in wool. For example, we have documents recording tens of thousands of sheep in herds around Knossos and Pylos and elsewhere. And so we can test this by looking at changes in species at individual sites. And during palatial periods, for example, at Nicoria, which I recently published in 2020, we can see sheep becoming the most common domesticate animal in the LH3 period, which is when it's under the control of the Palisade Nestor at Pylos. At the same time, the slaughter age of sheep gets older, which fits well with an idea of focusing more so on wool production. So there's this relationship between the zooarchaeological and the textual record that's really fascinating here. In the late Bronze Age, things are fairly homogeneous, and we can see this relationship between the zooarchaeological record and the textual record. When we move into the early Iron Age, the next phase, things really change. Look at this. So here's the late Bronze Age. Things are fairly homogeneous, a lot of sheep. To this, a lot more sites focus on goats. Things are a little more heterogeneous as different settlements are focusing on different animals. So what's an explanation for this is potentially due to the end of palatial society. So the economies that were present in the late Bronze Age are no longer having the same kind of impact on animal production. As well, there's more growing evidence for climate change. It's drier in the early Iron Age than in the earlier periods in the late Bronze Age. And so I just recently published this with Martin Finet, and we can see this pattern where the sites where goats are the most common animal are mostly in the eastern part of the mainland and in Crete. And these are also the drier areas of the Greek world, of the Greek peninsula and of Crete, because of the mountains that run down the middle. The western portions get twice as much rainfall as the eastern portions today. And so it seems likely that the shift from sheep to goats is an adaptation to climate change at this time. So, okay, we've seen a few of these bar graphs. I hope you're getting the hang of them. But when I first presented these results on goats, I presented at the American School in Athens. I went online and I asked my followers on Twitter and my friends on Facebook for photos of goats. And this call quickly went viral. I got a lot of really interesting and fantastic photos of goats to be able to lighten up presentations like this, right? Most of these are from friends and colleagues, but the call kept going out, and people all over the world started replying with fantastic, beautiful pictures of goats. And then shepherds from throughout America and elsewhere started replying with photos of their goats. And it got to the point where animal behavioral scientists saw this tweet, and they started sending me photos of goats. And so my key point here is that I have a really good set of goat photos, and we're going to see why that matters in a second. But back to some bones. So early Iron Age settlements, fairly heterogeneous. There's this impact potentially from climate change. We see this heterogeneity with different settlements focusing on different animals, probably persisting into the archaic through Hellenistic, the historical periods of ancient Greece. I really wonder if this might relate to the polis system, where there's these kind of regional entities, these local entities that control their own sort of politics and economy and things like that. We do see more sheep showing up, but the data set's not very large from settlements in this period. Instead, we have a much larger data set from sanctuaries. And sanctuaries are interesting because we can start to see the role maybe not just of economy, but of ritual preference. So the settlements or the sanctuaries where pigs are the most common are typically sanctuaries where Demeter and Kore and Persephone are worshipped. And the sanctuaries where cattle are most common are sanctuaries where Poseidon or Hera are worshipped. Michael McKinnon has published this pattern. And so there's this kind of choice that's going on here that's divorced from economy and from diet and things like that. It's a different formation process, if you will, when we compare sanctuaries and settlements. So how does all this archaeological evidence relate to our textual record when we count these animals in Greek literature, right? This is actually kind of fascinating because it's very different. In Greek literary sources, cattle are mentioned, because remember these are mentions, more commonly than other animals on average in most genres of ancient Greek literature through 300 BCE or so. And this really just does not jive well with the zooarchaeological evidence, and this really threw me for a loop for a while. Nor does it really jive well with the sanctuary evidence. We have a few settlement sanctuaries where cattle are the most common, but most of them, it's still sheep or goat, right? And so what is going on with this? When I for the first time presented this pattern, I started thinking, all right, well, what about today? Does what we eat track with what we write down? And so we can see this change in American sort of meat consumption, with chickens slowly becoming more commonly consumed than beef over time, really starting with the development of factory farms in the 40s and the 50s and really picking up until it's only in the last decade or so that chicken has become the most commonly consumed meat in America. If we do a quick search of the words chicken, beef, pork, and turkey in English books, courtesy of Google Ngrams, this actually tracks pretty well. Chickens start becoming more common, and they overtake beef in the 70s before they do in our diets, but there's an interesting sort of correlation here. So why does this correlation not exist in ancient Greek literature and ancient Greek bones? And so this is really fascinating. So when I presented it the first time, I took to Twitter and I said, hey, followers, send me some photos of cows to kind of illustrate my lectures on this, right? And so I got a few nice cow photos. I got some from some shepherds and some archaeologists and some colleagues and friends of mine. But most of them, A, I didn't go viral. B, I didn't get as many. And most of them kind of looked like this. They were lame pictures of cows because cows just aren't as cute as goats. I mean, look at these goats. They are precious, right? They are just so cute. And it's no wonder that everybody has wonderful photos of goats. And this is why every single year, it seems like there's an article online about how it's the year of the goat. The internet is full of goat pictures because goats are extremely photogenic. Even though we don't eat very many goats, we love to see cute goat pictures, right? And videos and things like that. And so when we look at ancient Greek vase painting, we also see lots of cows, much like with literature. And so there's something going on here. Cows in ancient Greek culture have this kind of cachet in the way that goats on the internet have a cachet, right? There's this kind of value, this cultural value to them that has them show up as the most predominant domesticated animal, or at least domesticated animal that we eat. These accounts come from Volkert van Strenten's Hieracala book. Is more common than sheep or goat or pigs. And so this is showing up in literature and iconography. And so I think this has to do with values. These are productions of elite ancient Greek individuals for other elites. And so that's what we're starting to see here is we're starting to see the values of different animals. And that's coming out in these kind of counts. On the other hand, if we look at kind of documentary evidence, so sacrificial calendars, the number of animals slaughtered for different festivals, inscribed on stone in a given year for the Attic demes of Erchia, Marathon, and Thorikos, we're getting something that's more reflective of the zooarchaeological record, which is that we're seeing a lot more sheep, for example, sheep and goats, and fewer cattle. And so in a sense, these are documents of what happened on the ground. And that matches better with the sort of animal bone evidence that we have on the ground as well. And so I think that this is really fascinating when we can start to see how iconography and literature gives a sense of value. We get the sense that goats, for example, are fairly pejorative. They're described as smelly in literature, while cattle are focused on in sacrificial feasts, right? And so I always like to say that there's truth in the trash, right? So the trash is what carries the truth here. It's what people were actually eating. But at the same time, iconography, literature, this is valuable too to be able to count what's going on there because it shows what has cultural value, right? It has a certain cultural cachet. It has a meaning to people in the past. And so I think we really need to be using both of these forms of evidence to better understand the past, these ancient people, but also to better understand one another. And so we can look at this by thinking about the formation processes of these records. And so this is fairly well understood for sort of the archaeology, the zooarchaeological record. We're interested in what people were actually doing. So they're livestock, right? They're herds. But this is, of course, biased by cultural formation processes. How are they slaughtering the animals? Where are things deposited? Then it's further altered from natural formation processes. Is the soil acidic, so only large cattle are surviving? It's further biased by excavation methods. And then we end up with a kind of archaeological assemblage of 100% minus X%. And zooarchaeologists have been focusing on this for a while, right? We've been looking at these kind of biases. You can look at, so I have several publications on formation processes and taphonomy, and how the soil has destroyed bones. But what's really interesting also is the kind of cultural formation processes, this area, looking at the different deposition by humans across the settlement. And I think we can relate this then to kind of texts and to art and things like that. So let's throw in another species. Let's throw in equids, so horses, donkeys, and mules. They don't really show up at ancient Greek archaeological assemblages from settlements. So these are the same settlements we saw before, from Archaic through Hellenistic period in Greece. In red now are the equids. They're really just not there. Why? Because they weren't commonly consumed as food. I mean, they were occasionally. I get butchery marks on some, but it wasn't very common, and so we don't have very many. And so instead, they're showing up in cemeteries. So for example, I studied a series of horse burials at the cemetery of Phaleron outside of Athens. And so here, all we have is horse bones. They're 100% of the assemblage that I've studied, but at the same time, they're very selective. It's not the entire horse population even, it's mostly just young males. And they're very clearly displayed in their graves. If you want to see more, I want to give a plug. January 20th in the Gennadius Library of the American School of Classical Studies at Athens is an exhibit on these horses, as well as other horse art curated by Jennifer Niles. And you'll see some of these horses I've studied from Phaleron. Now, this gives a sense of cultural formation processes. There's a selective deposition of animals in specific contexts, right? So our animal bone assemblages, they are true to a certain degree, but they don't present the whole picture because they're very selective at times. We have a whole lot of dogs, for example, in the Agora bone well in Hellenistic Athens, but those are pretty much street dogs, as Lynn Snyder published them. They're all adults, they're all gnarly and mangled from a harsh life on the streets. They aren't pets. They were probably sacrificed in a very clear ritual. So there's something going on here with this selective deposition. And this is what we call cultural formation processes. And we can kind of look for this in literary sources as well. So if we start plotting equids onto these same kind of bar graphs of literary sources, it's really quite fascinating. We don't get many in Athenaeus. He's focused on food, right? We don't get many in medical texts focused on different regimens. Where do we get horses? We get them primarily in epic poetry. We get them in history, historical texts, Thucydides, Herodotus. We get them in legal texts. And this makes sense. These kind of texts focus on contexts that relate to where horses might be, like warfare. So, for example, on the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, horses are now, I'm blanking, I think they're the 13th most common lemma, the 13th most common word in the Iliad. I need to go check on that number. And so this is kind of cool. Horses show up a lot there because that's the focus there. It's kind of a form of cultural formation processes based on what different genres or texts or subject matters focus on. But we can go even further and we can start to see biases in the formation processes of our textual evidence. So for example, if we look at aquatic animals, so shellfish, fish, and we start plotting them on, they don't show up very often in epic poetry, which is something that's known. It's actually commented on in the past that Homer does not mention much fish, right? His heroes are eating cows and they're riding horses. On the other hand, we get a whole lot of fish in Athenaeus. Which I think is really quite fascinating, that we have so much fish in Athenaeus. And I think this might impact our understanding of ancient cuisine. So James Davidson has published in his book, Courtesans and Fish Cakes, how the term opson changes meaning in the 4th century BCE from kind of an accompaniment to grain, so legumes, meat, etc., to specifically fish, kind of luxury. what I'm wondering is if we're being thrown off by the way that we're getting our 4th century and 3rd century literary evidence. So much of it comes from quotations that have been handed down to us from Athenaeus' Deipnos Sophistatai. He quotes a lot of new comedy written in the 4th and 3rd century BCE, and that's where we're getting a lot of this fish. And so are these mentions of fish that we date to the 4th centuries and the 3rd centuries BCE representative of new comedy? Are they representative of diets at that time? I'm not so sure, because they're being modified by Athenaeus' selection of them and put into his later Roman text. And so this tells us about cultural formation processes of our evidence for animals. And it comes out really clearly when we start to quantify it in this manner. So for those of you that are still awake, a few conclusions. 1, animals are really unique. There's large data sets that exist across our different evidence records, and quantifying them shows just how important they were to Greek culture. It shows us about animals in the past, but it also shows us about the relationship between our sources of evidence. The truth is in the trash. We need to do more zooarchaeology, archaeobotany. A lot of the talks in this session are on that. There's a lot of evidence there that helps us contextualize more traditional evidence. So we need to really do a lot more of that, because it lags behind iconographic textual studies. As well, these quantitative methods reveal formation processes in these variety of records. This is really kind of cool. I think this will allow us to apply archaeological theory and methods to a wider variety of data sets like literature and art. At the same time, though, there's some downsides. Oh, I'm in the way. There's biases in these records, so we can't just kind of lump them together and say, all right, now we understand the past. No, we need to do this in a comparative fashion. We can't lump together different forms of evidence. They speak of different things. They have different formation processes, and we need to understand those formation processes to better understand both our evidence and ancient people. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions over Zoom, or if you're watching this on email or Twitter. Thank you.